What particularly fascinates me about the process vision of reality, or what's sometimes called process theology, is the way in which it offers me an adequate grasp of the reality of God, one that doesn't violate some concerns that are quite basic in my own understanding. I want to be able to conceive of the power of God in such a way that doesn't violate a very genuine sense of the reality of human freedom, the importance of genuine choice, that what we do, what we decide to do in the world really makes a difference, and yet God's role in the world must somehow be seen to make a difference. Now that's very crucial in regard to the way I understand my faith. Let me explore with you some of the consequences of beginning to think about God in respect to what's called the process vision of reality. Traditional modes of understanding God in the Christian faith have been particularly influenced by the shape of Greek philosophy and Hellenistic thought around the time of the New Testament and shortly thereafter. And these approaches to the understanding of God focus particularly upon the necessity of conceiving of God as perfect. In order for God to be God, God must be absolute perfection in that point of view. Well, for example, then, such a God would be understood to be beyond the capacity of change, because if God were to change from one state of being to another, you would have to raise the question, which one of those states of being was the more perfect of the two? And you would have, therefore, by implication, a partial expression of the reality of God at some point in time that was less than perfect. So perfect God must be seen as unchanging. Such a perfect God must be seen as not influenced by anything outside of God's self, because any ability of any element of the world, any aspect of creation, to impact God in some way would make God be seen to be dependent upon, responsive to, influenced by that which is not God, the world. So God is impassive. God does not suffer, is not influenced by the world in any way. God is accordingly omnipotent in the sense of being the only power who counts. There can be no manifestation of any other motive power that could be seen to have any impact upon the way in which God works things out. God as beyond change, God is omnipotent, is therefore also a God who is all-knowing. And that totality of knowledge means there are no surprises for God. It's all already present to God in regard to what will transpire in the world. That knowledge is unchanging, and so it's there eternally in the being of God. Well, there are aspects, there are very strong aspects of those traditional notions about God which have deeply pervaded Christian understanding, in spite of the fact that the fundamental thrust of the biblical way of viewing God is that God is a living deity. God is a God who is in dynamic interaction with God's creation, God's people. God is a God who loves and cares for that creation, the people of that creation. God is a God who is responsive to the cries and pleas and concerns and joys and experiences of that creation, those people of that creation. How do you integrate these two? This notion that God must somehow be perfect and absolute and self-contained and all-knowing and beyond change on the one hand, and a God who is a kind of power, a dynamic power of love and interrelationship. The process vision provides me a way of getting back to that biblical vision. What process theology maintains about God is that the perfection of God is precisely in a perfection of relatedness, not in a kind of purely isolated existence all to God's self, but that God is, we might say, perfect in love. God is the one who is most fully in relationship with all of God's creation. There is nothing that transpires in the totality of the universe that is not immediately present to God, felt by God, taken up into God. Nothing is lost. Nothing is ignored. Nothing is beyond the pale of God's powerful presence. Well, if God is intimately involved in everything that is going on throughout the universe, and God is therefore intimately involved in my life, one can then raise in a very vital manner the question of the nature of the power this God displays in God's relationship to us. What kind of power are we talking about here? Are we talking about a classical definition of power in the sense of the power to control the outcome? We would like to aspire to that kind of power. We want to have, we feel, a sort of influence on our surroundings in which we make an impact and the impact is felt. We can control the outcome. We can determine. We can decide the way things will go. We look upon persons who manifest that kind of strength as very powerful persons indeed. Is that the kind of power that God displays? Is that the manner in which God is powerfully involved in God's creation? Well, if that were, we would be back to the problem with which I began to focus these brief remarks, that in some way or another the issue of our freedom would be called into question. If God is a God who controls the outcome, whose power is omnipotent in that traditional sense, in what regard then do my fledgling attempts to decide what I will do with my life, the degree to which I will respond to those inklings of a call from God to behave in a certain way, in what sense do my responses really make any difference? Or are they controlled by this omnipotent deity? Let's consider the possibility, the very real possibility, that the manner in which God is powerful in my life is in such a way as not to diminish my freedom but to enhance it. Now, again, traditionally, there has been seen to be the kind of conflict I've identified. The greater God's power, less I seem to be free. The more free I am, the less God is involved in my life. One might encapsulate that in a shorthand phrase that says, the more, the less. The more God impacts, the less I'm free. The more I'm free, the less God and God's different, the less difference God makes in my life. Wouldn't it be delightful to entertain the possibility of a different formula, which one might briefly identify as the more, the more? That is to say, the more God is powerful, the more free I am. The more God is at work in my life, the more real, legitimate freedom I truly have. Now let's explore what that might mean. If the nature of God's involvement in regard to the world is of the sort that God is endeavoring to draw forth from creation the best possible responses that we might make at any given moment to what God has to offer, that would mean that God is truly involved in my life. God is not simply sitting somewhere aloof from the universe, sort of watching the temporal progression of events unfold, and perhaps occasionally dipping God's toe into the historical waters in the mode of supernaturalism, the concept of divine intervention, the notion that at times God simply allows God's laws to work out their consequences in the world, but that at other times God might, for one reason or another, selectively intervene into the course of events and make something happen that otherwise would not be expected to come to pass. Well, that kind of power in abeyance, that notion that God has a reserve of power to draw on if God chooses to, again is a diminishing of my freedom. It seems to cancel it out. That doesn't follow the notion of the more, the more. That recognizes that when God is truly involved in the world, worldly explanations of causation and influence are canceled out. God intervenes to become the causal agent. Again, calling into question the genuine reality of human freedom. Well, okay. Do we have then this other possibility at hand, that we can recognize that God is genuinely interrelated in the affairs of the world, your life, my life, not in the sense that God controls what is happening, and not in the sense that God is only selectively intervening into the course of events, but in the sense that God is constantly, continually active in an influential, in an evocative way to try to somehow empower my response, my life, that enhances my freedom. My conviction, which has been very strongly shaped by process thought, is that the way in which God relates to the world in any given moment is to offer to any momentary experience, any becoming occasion of experience, the moment of my next conscious moment of existence in my life, offers to me an optimum possibility. That may indeed involve perhaps preconscious, certainly creative proposal that transcends the habits in which I exist, the traditional patterns of behavior that I manifest, that are deeply shaped, even perhaps seemingly determined by my past, by the nature of responses that I have made in the past. Perhaps God is trying to break through into my life, to offer a new possibility. If I were to respond to that lure of God, that evoking of a different response, that would be a manifestation of a freedom from bondage to my past, a freedom from the necessity to simply repeat patterns of behavior that I have already learned and have manifested. That, in other words, the more God was able to be influential upon my behavior, perhaps the greater my own freedom might be realized to be more than I have been, to actualize a response that is beyond simply what my past might have suggested. Now, I believe that it's very possible, I think it is very meaningful to characterize this notion as a divine power identifiable as the power of love. Again, in much of traditional thought, love and power do not seem to go hand in hand. One seems perhaps to cancel out the other. Where there is power, there is the insisting upon one's own way. And Paul said that love does not insist upon its own way. Love is more an act of offering, of sharing, of self-giving, perhaps an act of empowering. Is it perhaps then meaningful that we might conceive of divine power as a power of love that empowers us, that evokes from us but does not insist in us, does not demand from us, does not control in us that response of love, but simply evokes it. Now, in such a situation, of course, there is an element of risk. I may well decide to refuse the offer, the challenge, the opportunity that God is affording me in this moment. I may simply reenact my past behavior, whatever negative habits have developed in my life, may resist the call of God. There is no guarantee that the power of love will have exactly the impact, the influence that God intends. I believe, indeed, this is exactly the way it is, the way of God with the world. There is risk in God's relatedness to all of creation. There is risk and there is resistance and there is rebellion and there are consequences of that rebellion. There are consequences of evil in the world that result from the sin of resistance, of rebellion, of refusal to let God be God in my life. And that therefore what God is able to offer me in this moment of my life is bounded by those factors that have emerged in my life, in the world, in society, and culture in general, such that there are specific contexts into which that loving offer of God is directed, into which the power of God is presented. Now, In a situation where love entails risk, in an understanding in which the power of God is not a coercive power, but an offering, sharing, empowering mode of power, in such a situation as that, one must then also recognize the sense in which the future is open to God as well. The knowledge of God, I genuinely believe, is total and is perfect. But I believe that it is genuinely accurate knowledge, by which I mean God does not get confused about time. God does not relate to the future as if all the risk were eliminated and all the decisions were made. God knows the past as past, that realm of creaturely existence in which the decisions have already been made, and once made cannot be canceled out, though those decisions continue to influence further ones. The present is the moment of becoming, the moment of deciding, the degree, the element, the aspect of response that I will make, that all of creation will make. The future is that realm of undecided possibility, even for God. It is, in a sense, a realm of divine adventure as well as human and creaturely adventure, that according to the responses we make, according to the results of the risk of love in the divine worldly adventure, the possibilities for the future come to be more precisely shaped. We see, I think, a manifestation of this in the parable of Jesus about the what I want to call the prodigal father. Prodigal means extravagant. We talk about the son being the prodigal one, the extravagant one with his fortune. I think the father in that parable is very prodigal in terms of the extravagance of that father's love. The son takes the inheritance and goes away to a far country and squanders it. There is risk in the father's behavior in responding to his son's request with that generous granting of a portion of the inheritance. There is uncertainty as to the outcome. There is no guarantee the son will return, even that he will survive. There is a sense in which he is already lost, perhaps is even dead. And yet, it's not by accident, is it, that when the son who has come to his senses is on his way back to his father's house, thinking to himself, I won't ask to be made once again a son in my father's household. I'm willing to experience the life of a servant. I'll get out on my knees, as it were, and grovel. The one who sees him coming while yet afar off is none other than the Father. By accident? No, I don't think so. There is a sense of patient, persevering caring in that behavior, an openness to the possibility that the response will be made, and an enthusiastic reception and greeting. My son who was lost has been found. My son who was dead is alive again. Let's celebrate. There was risk in that behavior. There was uncertainty as to the outcome. And in the case of the prodigal father, there was an expanse of love that was not conquerable, not eliminatable by any circumstances, such that we see manifested in the father's behavior the sense in which that love, now made available in a new way, empowers a kind of restoration of wholeness that had been broken as the relationships had been broken. I believe, in other words, in a God who is powerful in my life, but powerful in a way that takes into account my freedom, is powerful in a way that enhances that freedom, is loving in a way that is powerful in my life. And that entails the risk of uncertainty, that in the divine human adventure or the divine universal adventure, the outcome is still in doubt. And the decisions we make in response to the impact of God on our lives makes all the difference, makes a very real difference, both to us and to the world and to God.